For years he had been drifting through life, caught in a cycle of routine that seemed never-ending. His days began before dawn, his mind consumed by the tasks waiting ahead. He had once been full of dreams, ambitions, and the spark that made everything seem possible, but somewhere along the way, life had taken its toll. What was once a dream job, the one he'd worked so hard for, now felt more like a weight on his shoulders. Each morning he woke to the same familiar feeling, tiredness that had nothing to do with how many hours he'd slept. It wasn't just his body that was worn out, it was his spirit. The excitement of the job had faded, replaced by a dull sense of obligation. It felt as if every day was a repetition of the one before it, with no clear end in sight. The moments when he had felt truly alive were few and far between now. He often found himself wondering how this had all happened. Just a few years ago, he'd been so sure of his path, driven by a desire to achieve something great. But the demands of work, the pressure to perform, the constant hustle, they had all come at a cost. The small compromises he had made, one after the other, had slowly chipped away at the person he once was. His relationships were another casualty of the years that had passed. He rarely saw his friends anymore, and when he did, it was always rushed, squeezed into the few free moments he had. He used to be the one who made time, who valued the connections that mattered. But now his phone buzzed with messages he never had the time to respond to, and he often found himself too tired to engage when he did get a message or call. Even his family seemed like a distant part of his life, something he felt guilty about but couldn't seem to change. And then there was his health, something he had once taken pride in. He had been active, always making time to stay fit and healthy. But now, even the thought of exercise felt exhausting. His body had become sluggish, and his energy levels seemed to decline with each passing day. He hadn't looked at himself in the mirror for weeks, hadn't even given it a second thought. He didn't need to see it to know what was happening. It was late one evening when he found himself sitting on a bench at a park near his apartment. The city was quieter than usual, a rare calm amidst the hustle and bustle of everyday life. He had just finished a long day at work, and for the first time in a while, he felt the need to sit and think. The cool breeze brushed his face, and he closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the city fade into the background. The park was a small space, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper in the wind. The light from the street lamps cast long shadows, creating a peaceful atmosphere. People passed by, some on their evening jog, others walking their dogs. It was peaceful in a way that he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. He opened his eyes and gazed at his reflection in a nearby window. He hadn't meant to look, but it happened naturally. The reflection staring back at him caught him off guard. For a moment, he didn't recognize the person in the glass. The face was older, wearier. The eyes, once bright and full of promise, were now dull, weighed down by years of stress and disappointment. His shoulders were slumped, as though the weight of the world had settled there, and his expression seemed distant, like he was looking through the glass at something far beyond it. He stared at himself, feeling an uncomfortable wave of recognition wash over him. This wasn't the man he used to be, not the one he had imagined becoming. This version of himself was someone who had forgotten what it meant to truly live. Someone who had allowed life's pressures to shape him into something he wasn't proud of. It was like he had been too focused on surviving to notice how much he had changed. Too caught up in the daily grind to realize that the person in the reflection wasn't the person he had wanted to be. The realization hit him hard. How had it come to this? How had he let so much time pass without making the choices that mattered? His work had always been important to him, but now it felt like it was all-consuming. He had told himself that the long hours, the missed family gatherings, the canceled plans with friends, they were all necessary sacrifices for a future he dreamed of. But now, staring at himself, he realized that the future he had been working towards wasn't the one he had imagined. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what he truly wanted. He sat there, feeling both lost and strangely awake. It wasn't just the reflection in the window that disturbed him. It was the recognition that this had become his life. He had become someone he didn't even recognize, someone who had forgotten how to be happy, how to find joy in the simple things. As the minutes passed, he couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency building inside him. Time was slipping away, and he was still here, stuck in the same routine, the same cycle of self-doubt and missed opportunities. He realized that if he didn't do something now, this would be his life forever. He couldn't go on like this, living in the shadow of the man he used to be, watching life pass him by without ever truly living it. With a deep breath, he stood up from the bench. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stirring inside him, a faint spark of determination. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, or how he would go about it, but he knew one thing for sure. Things had to change. He had spent so much time focusing on what he thought he was supposed to be doing, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be truly alive. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that he was happy with how things had turned out. It was time to stop ignoring the truth, time to face the reality of who he had become, and take responsibility for the choices that had led him here. As he walked away from the park, he felt a strange mix of fear and hope. He wasn't sure how or where to begin, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the possibility that change could bring. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could become the person he had once hoped to be. The days that followed that evening at the park were filled with a mix of unease and determination. He knew that something needed to change, but the reality of change felt overwhelming. The reflection in the window still haunted him, like a reminder that he wasn't living the life he'd imagined. But at the same time, it sparked a desire deep inside him, a desire to break free from the chains of routine and take a chance on something different. The first step was the hardest. He didn't know where to begin, or what he was even looking for. The idea of change felt like standing at the edge of a vast, unknown sea, unsure if he was ready to dive in. He had spent so many years ignoring the things that truly mattered, and now it felt like he was trying to catch up to a version of himself he had left behind. But no matter how uncomfortable it felt, he knew he couldn't keep living in the same way. It was time to face the truth. He started small, deciding to give himself more space to think. At work, he had always been the first to arrive and the last to leave. It was a point of pride for him, a way to prove that he was dedicated and reliable. But now he saw it for what it was, a habit that kept him tethered to a life he didn't want. So, he made a decision. He would leave work at a reasonable hour. At first, it felt strange. The thought of leaving before everything on his to-do list was finished seemed almost irresponsible. But as he stepped out of the office at 6 p.m., he realized something. The world didn't fall apart. Nothing collapsed in on itself because he left on time. In fact, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. With the extra time in the evenings, he began to focus on things he had once enjoyed, but let slip away. He dusted off his old guitar, the one that had been tucked in the corner of his room for years. He had always loved playing, but somewhere along the way it had become just another thing to put aside. Now, as his fingers brushed against the strings, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in ages. Joy. The sound of the music reminded him of simpler times, of days when he felt free to pursue what made him happy. He also found himself reconnecting with old hobbies, reading, drawing, even writing. These were things he used to do without thinking, without hesitation. But as time went on, he had convinced himself that they were frivolous, not worth his time. Now he saw them for what they truly were, small pieces of himself that he had abandoned. Picking up a book or sketching on a piece of paper didn't take much effort, but it brought him a sense of fulfillment that had been missing from his life. At the same time, he began to take a closer look at the relationships he had neglected. He'd always told himself he was too busy to spend time with friends and family. That work came first. But as he reflected on it, he realized that work had never been the issue. The issue was his refusal to prioritize the people who mattered most. He reached out to an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years, and asked if they could catch up. At first, the conversation felt awkward, like they were both trying to find a rhythm they had long since lost. But as the hours passed, the conversation became easier, and they began to reminisce about old times. The laughter they shared reminded him of a part of himself he had forgotten. That night, as he lay in bed, he realized something important. Change wasn't about making drastic, overwhelming shifts all at once. It wasn't about turning his entire life upside down. It was about taking small, intentional steps that would eventually add up to something bigger. He didn't need to become a different person overnight. He just needed to start living in a way that felt more aligned with who he truly was. The next day, he made another decision. He would get more active, not for the sake of fitness, but for his well-being. He didn't expect to run a marathon or lift heavy weights. He simply wanted to feel stronger, more connected to his body. So he started walking every morning before work just around the neighborhood. At first, it felt like a chore, something he had to force himself to do. But over time, the walks became a welcome part of his day. The fresh air, the quiet moments, in the morning before the world fully woke up, allowed him to clear his mind and focus on the things that mattered most. Despite the small victories, there were moments of doubt. The pressures of work still weighed on him. He couldn't ignore the demands of his job, the deadlines, the never-ending tasks. But he started setting boundaries, learning how to say no when things became too much. It wasn't easy, and at times he felt guilty. But each time he made a choice that prioritized his well-being, he felt a little stronger, a little more in control. There were moments when he felt like giving up, when the old habits crept back in. It was tempting to slip into the comfort of what he knew, to return to the cycle of overworking and neglecting his own needs. But each time he found himself slipping, he reminded himself of the reflection in the window, the person he didn't want to become. He couldn't let that version of himself take over again, not when he had already come so far. One evening, after another walk around the neighborhood, he stopped at a small coffee shop he had passed countless times but never entered. It was one of those quiet places, tucked away from the bustle of the city with warm lights and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. He decided to give it a try, taking a seat by the window with a cup of coffee in hand. As he sat there watching the world pass by, he realized how different everything felt. He hadn't allowed himself moments of peace like this in years, and it felt good. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about work, about his responsibilities, or about the endless list of things he had to do. He was just being. It was in that moment that he understood something important. The journey of change wasn't about erasing everything he had been. It was about learning to live with intention. He didn't need to become a different person. He simply needed to reconnect with the parts of himself that he had lost. The hobbies, the relationships, the self-care, all of these things were important. They were the things that made him feel alive, and they were worth making time for. As he left the coffee shop that night, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He wasn't completely different, and he knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. The change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was finally taking the steps he needed to reclaim his life, and that, he realized, was all that mattered. As the days went on, the changes he had begun to make started to feel more natural. There were moments of uncertainty, of course, but they no longer paralyzed him. He had started small, but now it felt like he was gaining momentum. The morning walks, the time spent playing the guitar, reconnecting with old friends, each of these things brought him a sense of accomplishment, even if it was just in small doses. Still, he knew that real change would take time. It wasn't enough to just make a few adjustments in his routine. He needed to dig deeper, to understand why he had allowed himself to lose sight of what mattered in the first place. One evening, after a long day at work, he sat down in his living room and stared out of the window. The view from his apartment wasn't much, just a few buildings and a busy street, but he found himself mesmerized by the passing cars and people. He thought about how, for years, he had been moving through life without really noticing what was happening around him. His days had been filled with the noise of deadlines, meetings, and to-do lists. But now, as he sat in the quiet, he realized how much he had missed by being so focused on getting through the day rather than truly living it. That night, he decided to take a different approach. He grabbed an old journal that had been tucked away on a shelf, hidden behind stacks of books and forgotten notes. It wasn't the first time he had picked it up, but it felt different this time. He opened it to the first page, and the words from his younger self stared back at him. The pages were filled with dreams, aspirations, and goals he had once held dear. He remembered the person he had been, someone who saw the world as full of possibilities, someone who believed that anything was achievable if you worked hard enough. Reading those words made him feel both nostalgic and a little sad. The person who had written those entries seemed so full of hope, so certain of what the future held. That person was still inside him, but somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with that version of himself. He had allowed life to wear him down, to distract him from what really mattered. He had sacrificed the things that once made him feel alive for the sake of a job that, in the end, wasn't fulfilling him in the way he had hoped. As he continued to read, he realized something important. He had spent so much time trying to meet the expectations of others, his boss, his colleagues, society, that he had forgotten to live for himself. The journal was a reminder of who he had been, and more importantly, who he still could be. It was like finding a piece of himself that he had buried under the weight of responsibilities and distractions. The next day, he made a decision. He would begin to take his dreams seriously again. Not in some grand, life-altering way, but in small, everyday choices. He didn't need to quit his job or change everything overnight. Instead, he needed to honor the things that had once sparked his passion, things like creativity, adventure, and connection. He would start by carving out more time for the things he loved, and not just when he had the time, but as a priority. He picked up the guitar again that evening, this time with the intention of playing for the sake of enjoyment, not as a task to check off his list. The familiar feel of the strings under his fingers brought him a sense of calm that he hadn't realized he was missing. It was as if he had forgotten how much music had once meant to him. For the first time in a long time, he played without worrying about whether it sounded perfect. He just played, letting the music flow without pressure. The next few days were filled with more of the same, small, deliberate actions that allowed him to reconnect with the person he had lost touch with. He found himself waking up a little, earlier each morning, using that time to enjoy the quiet before the world around him began to stir. He started reading again, losing himself in books that had once sparked his imagination. His evenings were no longer just about collapsing into bed after a long day at work. Instead, he made time for things that brought him joy, whether it was cooking a meal, playing the guitar, or simply sitting outside and watching the sunset. But as he dug deeper into this journey of rediscovery, he began to realize that change wasn't just about doing the things he had always enjoyed. It was about confronting the parts of himself that he had avoided for so long. It was about facing the uncomfortable truths that had shaped his life. The more he reflected on his past choices, the more he understood that his dissatisfaction with life wasn't just about work or the routine. It was about how he had allowed fear and self-doubt to hold him back. One afternoon, while sitting in a cafe, he struck up a conversation with the barista. They talked about everything from books to travel to life in general. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was enough to remind him of something important: connection. Over the years, he had isolated himself, making excuses to avoid socializing or reaching out to others. He had convinced himself that he didn't have the time or energy for it, but that afternoon he realized how much he had missed human connection. There was something incredibly fulfilling about talking to someone new, sharing stories, and connecting on a simple human level. That night he made another decision. He would make an effort to reach out to the people he had lost touch with. He sent a text to an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in ages, and invited them to catch up over coffee. He didn't know what would come of it, but he knew that it was a step in the right direction. Rebuilding connections, no matter how small, was part of the process of rediscovering who he was. The next few weeks were a blur of small, meaningful moments. He reconnected with several old friends, had long conversations with family members, and found himself saying yes to invitations he would have previously turned down. He started to feel like a different person, not someone who was trapped in the monotony of his old life, but someone who was actively engaging with the world around him. And it felt good, really good. But even as he began to make progress, there were moments of doubt. There were times when he questioned whether it was enough, whether the changes he had made would truly lead to a better life. He wondered if the old habits, the old fears, would always be there, lurking in the background, ready to pull him back into the life he had worked so hard to escape. There were moments when he felt like giving up, when the weight of his responsibilities seemed too much to bear. But he didn't give up. He reminded himself that change wasn't a straight line. It wasn't about being perfect or having everything figured out right away. It was about making small, consistent choices that moved him closer to the life he wanted. And slowly but surely he was starting to believe that he could be the person he had always dreamed of being. Someone who lived with purpose, who embraced joy, and who made time for the things that truly mattered. As he looked back on the past few months, he saw the progress he had made. He was no longer the person who had felt stuck in a rut, resigned to a life that didn't bring him happiness. He was on a new path, one that was filled with possibility and potential. And while there was still a long way to go, he knew he was heading in the right direction. He smiled to himself, knowing that the journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about what the future held. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He had made significant changes in his life, but the path to true transformation was not as smooth as he had hoped. There were moments when it felt like everything was falling into place, and then there were moments when he wondered if he was really making progress at all. It was easy to get discouraged when the old patterns and habits resurfaced, but he refused to give up. This time he was determined to stay the course. He had started feeling better physically and mentally. His morning walks had become a cherished part of his day, and the time spent reconnecting with old friends had filled a void he hadn't realized existed. But there was still something missing, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just about improving his routine or reconnecting with people. There was a deeper sense of discontent that lingered beneath the surface, a feeling that he hadn't fully dealt with the issues that had brought him to this point in the first place. One evening, after finishing his walk, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window. The night was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that often allowed him to think more clearly. He found himself reflecting on his past, on the choices he had made and the way they had shaped his life. He realized that the person he had become wasn't entirely the result of external circumstances. There was something within him that had allowed him to slip into this state of complacency. He had been so focused on pleasing others, on meeting expectations, that he had lost sight of his own desires and needs. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to fully acknowledge the role he had played in his own unhappiness. It wasn't just the pressures of work or the responsibilities that had weighed him down. It was his own fear of failure, his own unwillingness to take risks that had held him back. He had spent years playing it safe, choosing the predictable path over the one that could have led him to something greater. The realization was both painful and liberating. He knew that he couldn't continue down the same path, letting fear dictate his decisions. He needed to confront his fears head-on, to stop letting them control his life. But that wasn't going to be easy. The fear of failure had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his everyday existence. It was going to take time to untangle those threads and rebuild his confidence. The next day, he took a small but significant step. He signed up for a class. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just a painting class at a local community center. But it was enough to push him out of his comfort zone. He had always enjoyed painting in the past, but he had put it aside, telling himself that it wasn't practical or important. Now he realized that it didn't matter whether it was practical. What mattered was that it made him happy, and it gave him the chance to express himself in a way he hadn't allowed himself to do in years. The first class was awkward. He felt out of place, surrounded by people who seemed to know exactly what they were doing while he struggled to find the right brush strokes. But something unexpected happened. He started to enjoy it. As the hours passed, he became more absorbed in the process. The colors on the canvas seemed to come alive, and for the first time in a long time he felt a sense of accomplishment that didn't come from his job or his to-do list. He had created something beautiful, something entirely his own. The next few weeks were filled with more of the same. The painting classes became a regular part of his schedule, and slowly he began to see improvements in his work. It wasn't just about the paintings themselves. It was about the feeling of connection he had found again, not only with his creative side, but with his own desires and passions. He wasn't doing it for anyone else. He was doing it for himself, but even as he made progress in these small personal areas of his life, the reality of his responsibilities still loomed large. Work continued to demand more of his time, and there were moments when he felt the pressure of keeping up with everything. He had learned to set boundaries to say no when things became overwhelming, but it wasn't always easy. There were still moments of self-doubt when he questioned whether he was making the right choices. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at work, he found himself back at the park where it had all started. It had become a place of solace for him, a place where he could sit and reflect without the distractions of everyday life. He sat on a bench watching the world go by, feeling the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. He thought about how far he had come since that first moment of realization. The person he was now was different from the one who had stared at his reflection in that window, lost and unsure of where he was headed. He had made mistakes along the way, but he had also made progress. He had learned to listen to himself, to trust his instincts, and to take the time to prioritize the things that mattered. As he sat there, he realized that true change wasn't about eliminating the challenges in his life. It wasn't about having all the answers or creating a perfect existence. It was about learning to navigate those challenges with grace, to accept that life would never be without difficulties, but that he had the strength to handle them. He wasn't going to have it all figured out, and that was okay. What mattered was that he was no longer running away from his fears. He was facing them one step at a time. The next morning, he woke up feeling lighter, more centered. He had a newfound sense of peace that came from within, not from the external circumstances around him. The fears that had once paralyzed him were still there, but they no longer controlled him. He was taking charge of his life, and that made all the difference. He continued to pursue the things that made him happy: painting, reconnecting with old friends, spending time outdoors. He didn't have all the answers, but he had learned to embrace the journey, to trust that each step he took brought him closer to the person he wanted to be. The work still needed to be done, the goals still needed to be reached, but for the first time in years he felt a sense of fulfillment that wasn't dependent on external success or validation. It was a slow, ongoing process, but he was no longer in a hurry to reach the finish line. He had learned that life wasn't about rushing to the end, but about savoring the moments in between. And as he moved forward, he knew that the person he had become was someone he could be proud of, not because of his accomplishments, but because of the way he had learned to live with intention and authenticity. As the weeks went by, he found himself in a new rhythm, one that felt far more in tune with who he had always hoped to be. The small changes had added up, slowly transforming his life in ways that were hard to measure at first, but undeniable once he stepped back and looked. The morning walks, the time spent painting, the reconnections with old friends, all of it had brought him a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. But there was still something more he longed for, something deeper than the surface changes. One evening, as he sat with a cup of tea by the window, he realized that he had been so focused on external improvements, on getting his routine back in shape, on reconnecting with the people around him, that he hadn't taken the time to address the parts of himself that still felt unsettled. The fears, the insecurities, the doubts that had plagued him for years, they were still there, lurking just beneath the surface. He had come so far, but there was still this nagging feeling that he hadn't fully confronted the reasons behind his choices, the root of why he had allowed himself to drift for so long. The need to understand himself better, to make peace with the past, became a driving force. He had made strides, yes, but now he needed to fully accept who he was, not just the parts of him that had been easy to fix, but the parts that were more complicated and raw. The next day, he sat down and wrote in his journal, something he hadn't done in a while. His thoughts poured out of him, each sentence more honest than the last. He wrote about the years he had spent chasing approval, about the constant pressure to be something he wasn't, about the fear of failure that had held him back. He wrote about the times he had felt small, like his dreams were too big for someone like him. The act of writing felt like therapy, like he was peeling back layers he hadn't even realized existed. As he wrote, he also realized that part of him had been afraid to look at these parts of himself because it felt like admitting defeat. But the truth was, acknowledging his struggles wasn't about failure. It was about acceptance. He wasn't a perfect person, and he didn't have to be. He had made mistakes, yes, but that didn't define who he was now or who he would become. The more he reflected on his past, the more he understood that the key to real change wasn't about perfection. It was about embracing his flaws and learning from them. He had spent so many years trying to fit into a mold that wasn't his own, trying to be the person others expected him to be. But now he was finally learning to embrace who he truly was, the good, the bad, and everything in between. As the days turned into weeks, he began to notice something remarkable. He felt lighter, freer. The weight he had carried for so long was slowly lifting, not because the problems had disappeared, but because he had stopped running from them. He had stopped allowing his past to dictate his future. The decisions he had made, the mistakes he had learned from, all of it had shaped him, but it didn't have to define him. One evening, he met up with an old friend at a cafe, someone he had reconnected with recently. They talked about everything, old memories, current struggles, and the changes they had both been through. It was a conversation that felt effortless, like they had picked up right where they left off. Even though so much time had passed, in that moment, he realized something important. Change wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't about a single life-changing event. It was about making small, intentional decisions every day. It was about choosing to be present, to take the time to nurture the things that mattered most. He had spent so long trying to find the right way to live, the perfect path that would lead him to happiness. But now he understood that happiness wasn't something that could be planned or forced. It was something that came from within, from learning to appreciate the journey rather than obsessing over the destination. Over time, his relationships began to feel more genuine, more connected. He wasn't afraid to show up as his true self, flaws and all. The fear of being judged, of not being enough, had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from within. He no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. The only person he needed to be true to was himself. His work, too, started to feel different. He wasn't chasing promotions or accolades anymore. He was focused on doing the work for the sake of the work itself, on contributing in a way that felt meaningful. There was still pressure, of course, but he had learned to manage it differently. The work was no longer the center of his life, the thing that defined him. It was just a part of the puzzle, a piece of the larger picture. It was a quiet evening when he realized just how much had changed. He was sitting on the balcony of his apartment, sipping tea, watching the sunset. The city was buzzing with life, but he felt at peace. The person he had been, the one who had been lost in the rush of life, no longer felt like a stranger. He was here, fully present, and for the first time in a long time, he felt comfortable in his own skin. He had made peace with the person he was, flaws and all. He knew the journey wasn't over and that there would still be struggles ahead. There would be moments when the old fears resurfaced, when doubt crept in. But now he knew how to handle those moments. He had learned to confront them, to acknowledge them without letting them control him. He had learned that growth wasn't a destination. It was a continuous process of learning, evolving, and accepting who you were in every stage of your life. In the months that followed, he continued to live with intention. He made time for the things that brought him joy, whether it was painting, spending time with friends, or simply sitting in the park and watching the world go by. He had found a balance between work and life, between responsibility and self-care. And though the future was still uncertain, he faced it with a sense of hope that had once seemed impossible. Looking back, he realized that the journey had never been about perfection or achieving some ideal version of himself. It had been about learning to accept where he was, to embrace the process of becoming. He had taken small steps, each one leading him closer to the life he wanted to live. And though there would always be challenges ahead, he knew now that he had the strength to face them. In the end, he understood that the most important thing wasn't where he had been or where he was going. It was the person he had become along the way. And for the first time in a long time, he was proud of that person. Months passed, and as he moved forward in life, the changes that had started so subtly became increasingly evident. The steps he had taken to transform his daily routine, his mindset, and his approach to relationships had become second nature. Yet, despite the progress, there were moments when he questioned if it was enough. Life wasn't perfect, and while he had found a sense of peace, the world around him seemed as chaotic as ever. It wasn't always easy to maintain the clarity and purpose he had worked so hard to build, but what he had discovered over time was that peace wasn't a static state. It was something that had to be nurtured, day by day, He had learned to accept his flaws, to see them as part of the whole. That didn't mean they disappeared, but rather that they no longer defined him. He no longer measured his worth by the standards of others. He had come to understand that the approval he had once craved from the outside world was insignificant compared to the sense of self-respect and contentment he had found from within. But that didn't mean his journey was over. He knew that growth wasn't a destination. It was a lifelong process. Even when things felt stable, the work of continuing to evolve never stopped. The first time he really realized how much he had changed was when an old acquaintance reached out to him. It had been years since they last spoke, someone from the past who had seen him when he was in the midst of his struggle. The message was simple, just a friendly catch-up, but it caught him off guard. He hadn't expected to hear from this person again, and it made him think about how different he was now compared to the person he had been. The way he responded was telling. In the past, he would have felt obligated to impress, to prove how successful he had become. But this time, he just spoke honestly. He shared the truth about where he was in life, the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned. The conversation wasn't particularly deep, but it gave him a moment to reflect on how far he had come. He no longer needed to prove himself to anyone. He was enough as he was, not because of external achievements, but because he had learned to accept himself fully. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to hide his struggles or pretend that everything was perfect. He was content with the person he was becoming, flaws and all. The next day, he met a friend for coffee, and the conversation turned to similar topics, about how life had changed for both of them over the years. They talked about the ups and downs, the difficult moments that had shaped them, and how they had each found their way back to a sense of balance. What struck him most was how much more open and vulnerable he felt now, how comfortable he was sharing not just the victories, but the defeats too. In the past, he had kept so much of his inner world hidden, afraid of judgment. Now he realized that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was strength. It was what allowed him to connect more deeply with others, to truly understand and be understood. At work, things had also shifted. He was no longer driven by the same hunger for recognition. In the past, he had worked tirelessly, hoping that a promotion or a new title would finally bring him the satisfaction he sought. But now he found satisfaction in the work itself. He gave his best because he cared about the outcome, not because he wanted to impress anyone. He had learned to focus on the process rather than the results, knowing that doing his best was enough. The pressure he once felt to achieve more, do more, had lessened, and with it his sense of burnout faded. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still moments when the old doubts crept in, when the pressures of life seemed overwhelming. He would find himself questioning if he was truly on the right path, whether the changes he had made were enough. In those moments, he had learned to pause, to take a step back, and to breathe. He had learned to listen to the stillness within himself, to trust that the answers he needed would come. There was no rush, no need to have everything figured out. The process of living was enough in itself. One day, while taking a walk in the park, he stopped at the spot where it all began. The bench where he had sat months ago, lost in thought, staring at the reflection of the person he no longer recognized, now seemed like a place of growth. It was a spot where he had begun the journey toward understanding himself, where the first seed of change had been planted. As he sat there again, this time with a sense of peace rather than confusion, he thought about how far he had come. It wasn't just about the big moments of change. It was about the quiet shifts that had taken place along the way, the small decisions that had added up to a life he could now appreciate. He realized that the path he had taken wasn't about finding a quick fix or an overnight transformation. It had been about showing up for himself every single day, even when it was hard. It had been about making small choices that led to big changes. It was about giving himself permission to take up space, to stop apologizing for being who he was, to stop hiding his mistakes. Instead of running from his flaws, he had learned to embrace them. And in doing so, he had become more whole. And as he sat there reflecting on the journey, he understood something else. He didn't need to be perfect to be worthy of love, success, or happiness. He had spent so many years chasing an ideal version of himself, one that didn't exist, and it had cost him so much. Now he realized that perfection wasn't the goal. Peace, contentment, and authenticity were the things that truly mattered. Being honest with himself and the world around him was the real prize. He thought about the people who had been part of his journey, those who had supported him, those who had challenged him, and even those who had let him down. Each person had played a role in shaping who he was today. He felt gratitude for the lessons they had taught him, even if they had come through difficult experiences. He had learned to appreciate the connections he had, to understand that relationships, like everything else in life, required care and effort. And most importantly, he had learned to value the relationships he had with himself. That, he realized, was where everything started. The changes he had made weren't just surface-level improvements. They were changes in how he viewed himself, how he interacted with the world, and how he chose to navigate the challenges that life threw at him. He had learned that change didn't happen overnight, but that it was possible if you were willing to be patient with yourself. He had learned that progress was messy, non-linear, and often frustrating, but that it was worth every step. As he stood up and left the park, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He wasn't the same person he had been months ago, and while the journey was far from over, he had come to accept that that was okay. Life was a process, not a destination, and as long as he continued to show up, to keep growing and to stay true to himself, he knew that he was on the right path.